Welcome to the Datsusara podcast, where we talk with my favorite people about how to escape suffering and find your true path. I am your host, Chris Odell. All right, everybody. For those of you on the video feed, you will notice I'm looking a bit more disheveled than usual, and it's kind of dark in the room here, a little bit more than usual as well. It's because it's getting to be wintertime in the Pacific Northwest, so it is gray and dreary, and I'm about ready to go into hibernation for the rest of the year. But we do have important podcasts that have been recorded that I'm bringing to you still. And let's get to the next one going on today here. We are going to be talking with Jonathan Pageau. He is an Eastern Orthodox and general Christian Catholic icon carver. Now, I know that seems like a bit of a strange guest in some ways for me to be having on. As you know, in the past, I've been a bit of an outspoken atheist agnostic, really just somebody who is not a fan of organized religion, probably because I was forced through about 4 of them when I was a child. But we get into some of those issues with Jonathan. But I also started with the typical sort of Datsusara context of asking him about his career, and I have to say that being someone who does such a unique and artistic job is very much on the Datsusara sort of path, a great example of it. And you can't get more kind of out there than being an Eastern Orthodox icon carver. So, this guy sits around with, wood and stone and creates objects that have, spiritual and other value to people. And I think I find that really interesting. He's definitely followed his own path, and he's doing his thing. Not only that, the guy's a pleasure to talk to. I really enjoyed our conversation. Got to know him a little bit better when I saw him on doing some speaking engagements. But he's just a fun guy to talk to. And yeah, so we get into all sorts of stuff involving his work and all that. We obviously and we get into symbology quite a bit too. He does have a YouTube channel that I encourage you to check out. And he is kind of an expert on symbolism, symbology in general, and mythology as well, being part of that. So we get into a lot of that. I find that to be some fascinating topic. And then we dig into religion as well. Because I figured, why not? Let's ask an expert or someone who at least has some knowledge. I wanted to get into some of the things of literal versus symbolic interpretations of some of these the more Christian and Catholic religious points. We even got into some of the stuff that a lot of us would have your basic kind of arguments with religion, where you go, hey, well, what's up with the purity laws? Obviously that's ridiculous. Why can't you mix cotton with wool, blah blah? Well, it turns out even for that there was a bit of a logical reason, but you have to, if you don't have the interpretation or the symbolic background, you might not have figured out some of that stuff. And so it was really fun to talk to him and at least kind of understand these things better. And I really enjoyed it. So I hope you guys liked the conversation too. And I won't get any further with this. In fact, I got to stop doing these intros. I think it's a huge bottleneck because I sit here and try and come up with these, but it's it's one part that I don't really enjoy doing. I should probably just play the intro and play the episode and let you guys figure it out. But anyway, here you are, and I will quit blathering. Here we go with Jonathan Pageau.
What would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life?
Welcome to the Datsusara podcast.
If you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like doing in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing.
Jonathan, welcome to the podcast. And I think your last name, how do you pronounce it? Pageau, is that right?
Pageau. Yeah, it's hard to say in English because you don't usually have an ah sound and a je sound next to each other. So right. It's Pageau.
Pageau. Yeah. Okay, got it. Okay, so I wanted to have you on for a whole bunch of different reasons, but one of the things is that you have kind of a very unique and interesting career path, and I don't think I know anybody else doing what you do. So for people who don't know, what would you say that you do for a living?
So I mean, for the past 5 years, I've been an icon carver, which means that I make traditional icons for churches and for people, mostly in North America, but now it's all over the world. I just got a client from Japan just a few weeks ago, so So it's been, and the internet is really useful for that. I don't think I could be doing this without the internet, that's for sure.
That would be pretty tough, I imagine. How did you get into that? I mean, how did you decide on going that direction?
Well, it's really a long-term kind of decision making. I studied fine arts in Montreal, contemporary art, and I really struggled to, I had a Christian faith, and in university I was really struggling with those two languages. Let's say the language of contemporary art and the not just the language, but also the whole milieu of contemporary art, the gallery setting and the way, the legitimizing structure of contemporary art. And I just couldn't fit it with what I was trying to deal with in my life and in my interests. And so I was doing okay in terms of grades, but I certainly was clashing in terms of culture. At the end of my degree, like I actually finished first in my program, but the last day when I got my last evaluation, the professor told me, what are you doing here? You should go to seminary or something. Like, you're not in your place. And so it was kind of like, that was really surprising. I was in my 20s though, I was so cocky that it, at that moment it just flew over my head. But finally, I actually did end up just kind of abandoning contemporary art, just throwing it out, throwing everything out the window, because I just couldn't reconcile these different aspects of my life. And thought I would never do art again, actually. So I got a job. I worked in a downtown office building. I was working for a project management company. I did that for 5 years. And then my wife and we just felt like our lives didn't have a lot of meaning in terms of what we were doing. And so we actually became volunteers in Africa for 7 years. Oh, wow. So I lived in Congo and Kinshasa for 4 years, and then in Kenya for 3 years. And so it's when I came back from from Kenya, that was now in 2010, I was trying to find a job, but I had already been kind of discovering in my own spare time and in my studies this idea of a traditional art, let's say, an art that's rooted in a culture, that's rooted in a community, but also speaks to more, transcendent realities, let's say. And so I was learning on my own, but I never thought I could do it for a living. That's for sure. I was just kind of, reading. And the last year in Kenya, I lived in a village where they were carving this soapstone. It was like this pale soapstone that is almost kind of milky, greenish white. It's just beautiful. And when I saw it, I just kind of fell in love with this soapstone. And the carvers taught me to carve it while I was there. I lived there for several months, and they even made for me like this knife that's like a grinded down file that they put two pieces of wood around the part of the file, and they put like a bicycle, inner tube strapped around the thing. And that was like my carving knife. And I still have it. I still use it actually all the time. Awesome. And so it was like this initiation into this new kind of world of carving. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to make icons, just because of that desire to connect all these aspects of my life together. And when I came back to Canada, I was doing it in my spare time just to survive kind of psychologically. I was looking for a job, different projects. Nothing was really working. I would have little projects that seemed really interesting, and then it would just fall. And then I did that for like a year and a half. Things just kept not popping off. And I was like, what is going on? Like, what is happening? And by the time the last project just fell through, I realized that I had $10,000 of orders for carving. Wow. And it was like, it just kind of creeped up on me. And so I thought, okay, like, I don't have to ask myself what I'm going to do. I have an order, I'm going to make it. And I have another order, I'm going to make it, and we'll see what happens. And I just haven't stopped since then. Haven't run out of work since then.
Interesting.
It's just been this gradual, and so I pinch myself every day that I'm allowed to do this. I just go to my little workshop behind my house, and I get to carve. So it's been an amazing amazing journey for sure. Not a lot of money, but we lack nothing. We're fine. I make my payments, and that's what matters.
That's not bad. That's not bad at all, especially being in any artistic field. That's where you're doing what you want and you're kind of in charge of your own hours and whatnot. That's a pretty good thing. So we were pretty lucky because my wife,
we lived in Africa, and so we got used to this kind of simple lifestyle. We didn't have a choice, especially in Congo. We lived with the local people, in the local neighborhoods, and so you just kind of get used to this basic lifestyle. And my wife kind of even strives for that kind of basic lifestyle, and so for her, the idea of living very frugally and very simply is just not a problem. And so because of that, it's been easy to do it. Also, when we had jobs before leaving for Congo, even then we didn't like debt. We didn't want to get in over our heads. And so we both had really good jobs. And so when we bought a house, we paid off like 2/3 of the mortgage right away, with all the money we could gather and all the money we could kind of get together. And so we did that. And so now my mortgage is so small that living in my house is cheaper than renting an apartment. So it's like everything is perfectly set up for what we're doing now.
That's a good move.
Yeah.
So were there any particular challenges, along the ways to kind of getting to doing this as a profession? I mean, how did you even let people know that you were doing this and market yourself, I guess, as it were? Yeah.
Well, I went online before I went to Africa. I was doing, for that project management firm I was doing websites, and I developed pedagogical material, some marketing material. I did, so I knew that world, I knew a little bit of that world, and I kind of had a sense of how to market myself. And so I made a website, and then I put up my things on the website, and then I just spent 2 days just going online, finding every single possible type of person that could be interested in my product myself. I would just search for churches, for priests, for people who would be interested in the type of work that I was doing. And then just one by one writing emails to them, and writing hundreds of emails, just saying hey, I'm an icon carver. Why don't you come and visit my website? That was all I was saying. And so obviously you don't get a big return from that, but if you send hundreds of emails and then you just get, 2 or 3 returns, that's enough for what I'm doing, because the projects are pretty expansive. And so I'm basically selling time. I'm just, my work is the materials are nothing. I'm just selling my time. And so that kind of started, and that I also wrote to journalists. I wrote to other artists. I was just I did that for several days, just kind of intensely doing that. And then some people got interested. Someone wrote an article about my work, and then other artists who had projects started to say, oh, I have this guy who's doing something. Maybe I could involve him in this other project I'm doing. And that just kind of built up the people knowing about me. And what we did also is I started an online arts journal with other artists. And so we just got together and started producing content that was related to what we were doing. And there was a niche that wasn't being filled. We figured that out. And so we just kind of filled that niche. And luckily I can write. Not everybody is a writer, but I also had done a lot of writing. So I felt very comfortable doing that. And so all of those things together, kind of getting your reputation up there, getting people to just remember you as that guy who makes, carved icons. Yeah. And finally it just came to, and also building up, using the algorithms of the social media websites. I think if you figure it out pretty fast, on Facebook, what I started to do is I just started adding people, just adding any priest, because I was doing religious carvings, right? So adding every priest, every church, every single person that had, let's say religious art as their thumbnail, just adding. And after a while, once you get at a certain, let's say, you get a certain momentum going of having a certain amount of people, then it's Facebook, let's say, recognizes you as someone who's a hub, and then now people start adding you. And so now it's every day I get 20, 30 friend requests, let's say, and people just start adding you because it's you just use the algorithm to your advantage. So doing that now, I hadn't used Twitter, but now I'm starting to use Twitter and trying to figure that out, trying to see how people will start following you and what moves you need to make. So just trying to figure all that stuff out. Yeah. It's strange to have those two worlds though, making, carving stone in my workshop and, right. Coming home with dust all over my face and, coughing before I go to bed. And right. Then sitting at my computer and trying to figure out how YouTube's algorithm works. So it's kind of funny.
It's a real mix of low tech and high tech there for sure.
Yeah.
So what, as far as like how your daily motivation goes, I mean, do you find that you enjoy your work while you're doing it? I mean, do you wake up excited to do that, or do you still have to kind of go, okay, like do you have techniques that you use to kind of keep yourself in gear?
Yeah, I think I really do, because I do have like that artistic temperament, and so I have a tendency to scatter myself. Like that's for sure is part of my personality, and so I really have to watch myself. And the fact that I'm being attentive to social media and I'm using social media as a tool to get clients is like a huge possible trap. And so there are days when I just feel myself getting sucked into the social media thing, and I'm like, no, stop, trying to slap myself. Like the thing is like, get into the workshop. Like one of the things that I've started to do now, I used to not have a computer in my workshop because I thought I need to keep these separate and so that I don't get sucked in. But what would happen is I would get in the morning, start answering emails, start looking at the social media stuff, and then I would just get totally sucked in. And then like I'd look at the time like, oh my goodness, I've been here for 2 hours. Yeah. So now what I'm doing is the opposite. I have a computer in my workshop, but I'm standing to look at my emails, right? And it's a laptop. I don't have a mouse. It's not as comfortable. Like it's not as easy to kind of use it as it would be. And so that's actually when I get up in the morning, go to the workshop, then open the computer, check my emails. Like I don't want to just stand there in front of the screen with my little, with a pad, and it's just not comfortable. So I tend to go to the carving. So that's been the technique that I've used to help myself. Another thing I'm doing is I'm starting now to have more projects at the same time. And so when I feel like I'm getting pulled away from something, then it's like I have productive things that I can do instead of falling into, like useless Facebook scrolling or watching YouTube videos or whatever. Right. And so like I have I'm doing these drawings, I'm doing videos for YouTube now. I'm trying to monetize that right now. And I'm also have the carvings. And so I just kind of shift between those three depending on what I feel is like kind of pulling me, what is kind of dragging my energy out. But I love what I'm doing. I love carving for sure. Like one of the great things about carving is that when I'm carving, my mind is totally free. And so I actually can listen to podcast after podcast, or listen to, I take these online courses, history courses, philosophy courses, literature courses, or you listen to audiobooks all day. Like they have, what's it called? LibriVox, like there's this website where people just, for some reason, volunteer to read out books. I listened to War and Peace. Like it took me, it took an entire full-time month to like listen to War and Peace. And just like these people who, I don't know, like out of the greatness of their heart, just read out War and Peace for you.
That's pretty cool. I listen to a lot of audiobooks myself, so it's although I've been having struggle lately. Thanks to Peterson, I was trying out Crime and Punishment. Ooh, that's a hard one to get through in an audiobook. Just because of all the Russian, names and terminology and just different cultures. So I keep losing track, especially because I try to listen to it before bed, and then I wake up and go, oh man, what did I?
It's hard. No, what you've got to do for the Russian books, you have to. There's no choice. What you do is you go online, you find a list of the characters, right, and a little description of the characters, like one page. And what I do is I get it up on one page and I print it out. And then even while I'm carving, I've got this page next to me with the names, but it's not just the names. Each character has like 3-4 names.
Right.
So you don't even know. It's like Peter, and then he has whatever. It's like all these different names. They don't tell you, like you have to figure it out that it's the same person. Yeah. And so you have this page with the different names and just a little description of who they are. So when you hear a name and you're like, wait, who's that? Like, who's that again? You look down and you're like, okay, so I can keep focusing. Or else you're screwed. You can't. There's no way. It's like you listen to those long books and, characters vanish for a long time and they come back, but they're using a different name. And you're like, wait, who is that? I don't remember.
Yeah. That's a good tip. I've definitely been struggling with that, so I'll have to try that out. I noticed, too, do you always work outside, or is that just on occasion, or maybe it was just for the promotional video, but...
Well, yeah, and the promotional video is just for the promotional video. But I do. I have my workshop is back, is behind. And so on nice days, I can sit up outside, or depends where I open up all the windows. And I have 2 doors on my workshop. And so it's almost like I'm outside anyways. And so I just kind of, but I mean, I do live in Quebec. So that's
Probably
for a
can't
very
be outside
short
that
time.
often. Yeah, yeah. I'm still getting used to just the weather up here in Oregon. I'm a California boy, so trying.
Right.
Yeah, even it seems like it's always extreme here, where it's winter for nearly 8 months, and then you get a little bit of spring or fall, but then a hot summer. And either way, it's tough to be outside for long. But I love it when I can sit outside, even if I'm just checking emails or something. It's makes a big difference. It's much nicer.
Yeah.
So what advice might you have for somebody who's sort of, knows they're unhappy in their current work situation, but isn't quite sure what else they might want to do?
Well, I would say, I think that if they're not sure what they want to do, like I would say to just, obviously don't make any moves unless you're sure of what you want to do. Sometimes your job isn't everything, like it's not your life. And I think that for people who necessarily don't have like let's say a passion that can be monetized, the best thing is to maybe limit the effect that your job will have on your life, and then give yourself into whatever things that kind of make you passionate. The big thing is about money. It's like you just have to accept, if you accept not to have a lot of money. Like if you just accept that, if you're willing to live that way, you can do anything. Like there's so much you can do if you don't mind having an older car, if you don't mind not having the latest phone, if you don't mind that stuff. Like the problem is that people get caught up in these wheels, and they get huge mortgages, and then they get huge car payments, and then they have their phone payments and everything, and so they're like just at the throat. Everything's maxed out, and so like their lives, they have to stay in the wheels of the system, or else they're going to get crushed by it. And so I think that the biggest thing, if you're the kind of person that kind of complains that you can't do what you want, and that because you see that you meet people who like they hate their job, and they keep complaining, like they wish they could be woodsmen and like go camping all the time or whatever it is, and then you're like, yeah, but your whole life is set up against that. Like you're not telling the truth. There's something about what you're saying and the way you're living that there's a lie there, and somewhere in there, like maybe you feel like you have to prove yourself to others. I don't know what it is, but just maybe self-examination to find out like why your life is set up the way you are. And if you accept to have less money, like then you can live on not that much, by the way. It's not that, for sure in the US it's different. Like it is different. And I need to be very, for me, it's easy to say that. It's harder in the US because of healthcare. And for sure, like you have to be aware of that. And I don't want to speak over that because I know it's a big difference. In Canada with free healthcare, because of that, although the system is broken and deficient and it doesn't work so well, that if you have a really, really serious thing, you'll be okay. And because of so because of that, like we're able to, I think it's easier to kind of give up a lot of stuff and just throw yourself into a project, let's say.
Yeah, I can see that. I just they just re-upped our healthcare rates again this year. I just got the letter
because
yesterday.
you have your own company, right? So
yeah.
So you have to deal with that all yourself. Yeah,
it's not cheap, and then you add a kid in there and all that, and it definitely it adds up. But I think you're right in that a lot of this comes down to if you can structure your life in a different manner to help open up options for you that people wouldn't normally think they have. There's the typical path here, especially in the U.S., of just going into the corporate world and then getting the bigger house, the nicer car, all that stuff, and you just keep chasing that. That's definitely a bit of a problem. Not that those things are problems in and of themselves, but like you said, if you are struggling with what you want to do, but you keep feeding into this particular path that isn't going there, then it's not going to work out too well.
Yeah, and you have to kind of decide that there's some sacrifices that you'll be making. Like for myself, it's not the big house and the big car. Like for myself, it's been travel. Before when my wife and I both had kind of high-paying jobs, like we would go to Europe every year. We went to Mexico. We were always traveling, and so now we don't travel. Also because we have 3 kids, and so it's like for me that's a big. Like I haven't been to Europe since 2010 or 2009, I think, and it's like, man, for me that's a big change. And so, but it's like if I put it on a scale and I look at my life and I look at, the amazing things that I'm allowed to do and the fact that I work at home and all that stuff, it's like, okay, well, that's a lot more precious than the thing that I'm giving up. And so I'm willing to accept it.
Yeah. I've had to do similar in some cases where, luckily for me, I don't like traveling necessarily all that much, so it worked out. But it drives my wife crazy. She loves to travel around and get on airplanes. So I'm trying to find a balance somehow. Actually, we'll be traveling.
And you're surprised, because I thought I was going to give up travel for a very, very long time, and then now, recently in the last year and a half or so, like I've been all of a sudden, beyond my. I never thought this would happen, but all of a sudden, like, I attracted some attention with the talks I gave and, and YouTube and Jordan Peterson and all that stuff. And so now I'm being invited to talk all over the place. And so people are saying, like, hey, why don't you fly to Seattle, come to Vancouver, come to, Chattanooga. And and so I'm not going to Europe yet, but at least I can get a little bit of sense of motion and seeing other plations. So see, I didn't expect it. And there it is. So.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, and actually, speaking of that, you have done some talks and things, and what advice would you have for people learning to, articulate themselves a little bit better? Like, I know for myself, I seem to be very good at learning just enough about a topic to kind of notice when something's being presented inaccurately, but I would have a really hard time explaining to you exactly why that is. So sometimes it's difficult for me to say, I'm going to get up and speak on a subject. I've been invited to speak a few times, and I've always said, I don't know. I'm not so sure if I'm quite prepared for that. Is there something that you did over time, or a way that you've worked with your information in order to become a better speaker?
I think for me, the speaking comes out of writing. And so, quite early in my life, when I was a teenager, even in school and everything, I just like to write. And so I would always trying to focus on that. So if I would say, it depends if you can write, but I would say that if you're going to give, someone asks you to speak, what you can do is you can just write out your speech. And what the great thing about that is that if you write it out, then you can have someone read it, and that person reading it will tell you, like, okay, this doesn't make sense. This is chaotic. Like, there's no connection between these ideas. And so that can help you to kind of hone your thing. And I would say at the beginning, just read out the speech, just read it, and it's like, just to start, and then slowly you'll gain confidence. That's what I did too. Like if you look at the first talks I gave, it's like I've got my paper and I'm like reading out my paper, but I've really taken a lot of time to write it down and to think it through. And so it comes off okay. But then now more and more, I feel like I can kind of speak freely, but I still write it out. I write out all my speeches, even my YouTube talks. I write them all out. I can just write them out, and then I put them in front of me. And as I'm recording, I know that I can always go back to the text. Like, some people are amazing at improvising, and I'm not. I know that I'm not totally, and I'm not that good yet. But I'm hoping that I'm getting better. We'll see.
Yeah. I get a little jealous when I watch people like Joe Rogan, and he's just like the black belt of conversation. He can go for 3 hours not looking at a note or anything else, and just keep a conversation rolling and sound reasonably intelligent.
Yeah, with one person, he invites this one guest, and it's like I saw that podcast he did with James Damore, and James Damore. He's very soft-spoken. He's not he's not an entertainer. He's not out there. And so Joe Rogan is just kind of pulling him along, pulling him along the podcast, and and being even more kind of active and entertaining, almost to kind of balance out the calmer, soft-spoken guest that he's got. So yeah, he's really good at it. That's for sure.
It's pretty impressive. I wonder too if maybe some of that came from his experience being a comedian, but even comedians, they write down all of their material, of course, usually first. So that's interesting. Jordan had the same advice about that it comes from writing in a lot of ways, which of course sometimes frustrates me a bit, because that's writing. I like it when it's done, but I find it to be such a frustrating process. I'm much more of a audio visual kind of person, and so it's a real struggle sometimes.
Well, then you can do it the other way around. Like, why don't you? One of the things you can do, and I do that too. Like, when I give a talk, I make sure it's recorded. Okay, or even when I write down the speech, like, I'll record myself reading it, and then I'll put it in my earbuds and I'll work. And
Yeah.
I'll listen to, like, let's say with speech, I'll listen to it all day, like just over and over and over. And in my mind, I'm like picking out all the mistakes that I'm making, all the, the moments where I hesitate, all the moments where I stutter. And I still stutter. I stutter all the time.
Sure.
But, it's like my mind is working even if I'm not doing it consciously. So you could do that. You record yourself speaking in front of the camera and just watch it or listen to it. And then, you'll be picking out the mistakes. You'll see it. Oh, here I'm hesitating. Here I'm using the same word over and over, let's say, and slowly your mind will do it on its own. I mean, maybe not, but it seems like if you just put the effort into it, I think that you'll find ways to do it.
It's a good idea. If nothing else, at least could help me identify every time I use the word like inappropriately. I'm still trying to weed that one out. Oh, man. It'd take 30 years to get rid of that or something, I'm
The
sure.
West Coast is hard to get out of your system.
It really is. It really is. I didn't even notice it. And then one day I started really noticing, I'm like, oh, this is terrible. Grew up, especially Southern California. It was just, anyway, it's hard to break old speech patterns.
Yeah, I remember the first talk I gave at a university, I listened to it afterwards, and I kept saying, right?
Yeah.
The whole time. I kept saying it like every second sentence. I'm like, oh, that is the sign of someone who is insecure, like asking for confirmation all the time. Like, oh, do you agree with me? Do you agree with me?
Yeah.
Like, Jonathan, don't do that.
It's definitely challenging. So getting back to another one of your your expertise, I guess it makes sense. It's related to the icon carving, but you're very much into study of symbology, I suppose. Why do you think, what's important to you about symbology versus, let's just say on any given topic, like just laying out, basic facts to somebody, let's say?
Well, I think that the basic structure of our experience and the basic structure of how we kind of create our worldview, or let's say like our map of the world, is a narrative. And so we kind of inhabit stories and we inhabit images too. Yeah, it's both stories and images. And so and these stories and these images, they have structures and they have patterns. And what I think, and I'm pretty sure of this, is that those patterns of the stories and the images, they're kind of like the underlying structure of reality. Basically, they're the underlying structure of how we exist in the world. They're the frame, let's say, of our interactions. Because it's like, let's say you come home and then you have a discussion with your wife, and maybe you have an argument, and then finally you settle the argument. It's like, when you remember that, you're going to string those elements together into like a narrative of, let's say, the basic conflict and then how you resolved it. But if you actually like picked apart what actually happens, there's like a million things that actually happens, and there's a million little things of little off-subject moments, little times where you're thinking about something else, where you're actually not even listening to your wife anymore, or you have other emotions come in from other things, and it's like this big jumble of stuff. But then once you get through it, then your mind it'll do it automatically. You're not doing it consciously. It'll just structure it into a cohesive narrative. And so the way that your mind will do that is the kind of, it does it using the basic patterns of the narrative that I'm talking about, these patterns that are part of who we are, like that make us up, let's say. Not in a biological sense. Like a lot of people struggle when I say that, in let's say like how consciousness engages with the world.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So do you think a conscious knowledge of symbology is important, or do you think people get the same benefit from completely, unconsciously just absorbing these things?
I think that the problem comes in between.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the kind of, let's say the how can I say this? Like the peasant, let's say, in a medieval world, right? The peasant who has no education, let's say, and has no is not illiterate, but really lives grounded in the world. Like his life is grounded in this life. That person will inhabit those patterns in a kind of intuitive and really organic way. Mm-hmm. And so it'll just happen on its own. They don't have to be conscious of it. They'll be shaped by those things at the same time. The problem happens kind of in the in-between stage where people start to think they're smart and start to think like they understand things, and they start to analyze things, and so then they kind of pull away from that, and they can't see it anymore, and so then they come up with all kinds of crazy ideas, and then they'll sometimes try to fix the stories and change the narratives, and when you try to do that, it has a huge effect on reality. Like, it has a huge effect on how the world then proceeds historically and in terms of what's happening around you. And so it's like, once you've kind of come out of that, once you've kind of come out of like just the kind of basic, almost peasant life existence, it's like then you have to come to a more conscious understanding of these patterns, or else you deride them and you mock them because their appearance is very common. It's like, because it's so grounded in a kind of basic experience, they look at first glance, they'll look like superstitions, they'll look like things that are kind of childish, or that are really simplistic, but in fact they really hide like so much mystery. And so you kind of have to make that conscious effort so that you don't get pulled aside, left and right, and start thinking crazy things. So I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah,
it does. I mean, I've known people, especially, I definitely ran in crowds that took a lot of psychedelics when I was young, and I've seen people who've had kind of a break where they almost got just enough of a glimpse into a sort of a deeper meaning that they thought that they kind of understood everything, but it was almost too much for them. They started reading in far too much into every little action and every little thing, and they kind of went off into a not such a good psychological place. I knew a few people that we kind of lost that way. I don't think they ever quite came back. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's helpful is obviously to be grounded. I mean, this is to be grounded in a community, like to have that. That's one of that's the reason for religious traditions. Like, that's the reason why we have the church and liturgy and all those things, is because there is the danger when you have the spiritual experiences, or when you have the kind of the more mystical experiences, that you can kind of fly off the heel and kind of lose your mind. Whereas it's like the religious tradition on its own is not enough, because it's really like a box that kind of helps you to contain that experience. So you might say, why would you need a box to contain that experience? Well, your friend's story is an example of that. It's like, you need both sides. You need the possibility of reaching, let's say, those higher states, but you need something that gives the right language to it and gives kind of a coherent language. And so, like, to interpret those experiences within a tradition will help to make it a path, right? Instead of just like a flight and then a fall. It's like you have this path, and then you're moving on this path that's kind of laid out, and it's been laid out for you before you. It's like someone's gone on that road before. He's kind of moved the weeds out of the way. Like, maybe he bumped his toe on a rock, said, well, we'll move that rock out of the way, move that rock out of the way. And so now you can kind of follow that path in a more, so I think that's a good way to prevent the craziness.
Yeah. Well, I do wish I would have had a little more of that, something in place to help even myself when I was younger. I think, and I felt a little bit like a Prometheus type thing, where it was, or is it Prometheus that stole the fire from the gods kind of thing. And I think it can be a problem sometimes when you get exposed to all these deeper things, but you don't quite know how to integrate that or contend with it. And that definitely led me to some long, difficult years, I think, before I kind of learned how to reintegrate and what all those things really meant, and the best way to use that knowledge, as opposed to just being kind of just inundated with this immediate flash of information and all this stuff that you can definitely get led off on a bad path that way and think that you know everything, and it's I
mean, that's the whole idea of initiation. Like in any traditional religion, let's say you have this idea of initiation where you kind of enter, and there's someone there who takes you along, and it's usually like a ritualized process where it's like you have different steps, and that person will take you on those different steps. And so, in the Christian church, for example, in the early churches, you would spend a whole year as a catechumen. And so it means that you would not you would come for the half of the church service, and then they would kick you out of the church, literally, and they would close the doors. It's like you had to leave. You weren't ready for the next step, right? And then they would kick you out, and then you would spend a whole year like that, and then you would learn more about the mysteries and everything, and then they would they would baptize you and then finally take you in, and then you would take communion. And if you think about what communion is, I mean, it's just the craziest thing in the world. Like it's just the communion, the idea of eating, drinking blood and eating the flesh of the divine man, and and then this idea that it's also bread and wine, and it's this euphoric drink, and it's also like a kind of common food, and all those things put together into one thing. It's like you have to be prepared for that, or else it'll be meaningless to you. Like it'll just be nothing. It won't have the kind of transformative effect that it's supposed to have. And so there's that kind of process that brings you in. And I think that you see that in most kind of standard religious practices. You have that kind of step by step bringing you towards the higher mysteries, let's say.
Seems like a wise way to do things in some manner or another. Even Timothy Leary, it was all about set and setting, and he got a little off, and probably could have used a little more some more direction in a lot of ways. But it would have helps to have something, a frame of reference, a guide, anything. So before we get too far, I do have a lot of religious questions for you, which is, it's an area that I'm still somewhat allergic to and trying to get over that. But we'll get to that. But I wanted to ask you one more thing. You've analyzed the symbology in a number of current films, such as Shrek, Star Wars, Guardians of the Galaxy. I've got a background in film and TV, and I still watch quite a bit. I've noticed there seems to be kind of a real dearth of good or meaningful stories these days, and maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just getting older and picky, and I'm not understanding the kids or something. But even in superhero films, often the hero's not even very heroic. I've noticed not often, but on occasion at least. And, they're not trying to be the best version of themselves or be something that would be, inspiring, that we would, move humanity forward, that sort of thing. Do you have any analysis of, contemporary art that tells you something about the state of humanity? Does that?
Well, I think that one thing that is definitely worth paying attention to is the idea of how, let's say, media right now is constantly recycling old ideas. Like the fact that every single movie is a remake of either another movie or a comic book or a novel or whatever. Cool. And I think that that's really important because it's a sign of exhaustion. It's a sign of the exhaustion of a culture where, it's like, it's as if there's no juice, left. That it could be it, or it could be that it's setting up a more permanent storyline, let's say. That's also possible. It's possible that some of these stories, like some of the superhero stories, will kind of sink down and become a more, let's say, permanent storyline. I don't know. It's hard to know. I like, it's weird because I like the big Marvel movies. I like them because they're like watching fireworks. Like I like watching fireworks. They're
for sure.
pretty. Like the last Guardians of the Galaxy movie was like so pretty with like all these red and blue colors. I got a lot of color. But I usually watch movies trying to see the pattern in the movie as a sign of where the culture is. And I don't necessarily ask myself whether it's good or bad. Like I just try to see the pattern itself. I think that's the best way to interpret a movie is to the movie always, it tells you like what it's about most of the time. It's like especially in the first 15 minutes, it tends to tell you exactly what it's about. And then after that, it just plays out the basic theme. And so that's why, like, I don't, whether it's like, for example, like Shrek is really it's like an upside down fairy tale. It's like almost like a satanic fairy tale, but it's like, if you can look at it and see that that's what it is, then it's like, that's fine. You just have to call it out for what it is. It's an upside down fairy tale. And so, you can see the same, you can see that you can just kind of turn it back on its feet and say, well, this is how a fairy tale should be. Plop, put it back on its feet. And so, so there's all kinds of ways to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's been killing me how often sometimes I start a show these days or something and I go, wow, I don't like any of these characters. None of them are decent. They're all just sitting around arguing in silly egotistical conversations, and nobody's noble, nobody's heroic, I've just seen a lot of that lately, and maybe because there's also just more things being produced too. I mean, we have a much wider selection, so I suppose that's bound to
There's
happen.
another thing happening. There's another thing definitely happening, and there's this whole idea of the gray, like this whole idea of not wanting to show clear opposites, let's say, or not wanting to show clear figures. And so it's like, and it has to do with a lot of things that are happening. It's not just in movies or whatever. It has to do also with like wanting to discourage all kinds of clear identities, let's say. And so you see that morally too. And so you don't, there's not this idea of a virtuous character. Rather, it's all these gray characters with that have different, let's say, motivations that conflict with each other, and we just throw them in a room, and it's like you just watch them eat each other up. And so there's something about that. To me, that's something that shows kind of like a decomposition of culture for sure. But I think like there's still, you still get glimpses of this struggle for like virtue, let's say, and the struggle. Like, I'm gonna do an interpretation of Logan, the last Marvel movie, the last Marvel movies, and like in that movie, you really get this sense of this struggle for virtue. Like that's, Logan is just. He's just such a selfish, kind of self-imbibed character, and he's surrounded. For the movie starts where he's like in Las Vegas, and it's like the party town, and you can feel like this kind of this just self-indulgent world, and he just kind of moves slowly towards accepting his role, kind of as a son, let's say, towards Professor X, and then finally as a father, and then kind of giving his life for his child. It's like. That's pretty cool, and you get to watch him like cut people's hands off and stuff at the same time. It's like it's not bad.
Yeah, not bad at all. No, there are definitely some good stories. I guess that's the nice thing, even with a bunch of not so great stories, the good ones really stand out, and I'm very thankful for that. And especially even on TV, we got a real golden age kind of going on with how much great TV is out there. So back to my favorite, a topic that I know all my listeners, I'm going to have a long intro to this thing to explain to them why we're getting so deep into religion and what's going on with me, because they all think I've been abducted or something. But
you've been inducted into a cult of Jordan Peterson cult. Is that the cult you're in?
He definitely helped me, I suppose. Yeah, rescue the decomposing father from the belly of a whale or whatever. Yeah, so it's been hard because I went through. When I was young, I mean, I was baptized Catholic. I was kind of indoctrinated into Mormonism for a while, and then rejected that, and then I was kind of made to participate in some Presbyterian things, and then also Judaism. So I was kind of run through
Judaism? Whoa, that's like
stepfather came in.
Oh, your stepfather was Jewish. Oh my.
So he pushed me into that too, and I just being kind of a rebellious kid. I mean, I really fought against a lot of it, and I looked at a lot of the things and said, well, that seems ridiculous. Why? And nobody sat down and said, well, maybe this is there's symbolism here or other reasons why this is. You don't have to believe that the story of Noah is necessarily a literal thing in order to get something out of this. So, and of course, I mean, there are a lot of valid problems with organized religion out there, or there have been, mistakes, and whether it be from interpretation or just people manipulating it in ways. So I had a lot of issues. So like you made a joke, I think, that some people are, allergic to the very mention of God in one of your talks. And yeah, I was definitely one of those, and I'm trying to come to grips with it and sort of get some value out of these things that I previously tossed aside. So I think so. I've got a bunch of questions along that realm, and the first one is I think a lot of people, a lot of things that people have issues with in the Bible in particular come from the literal interpretations versus symbolic or metaphorical or mythological. People look at a lot of these stories and say, okay, they seem really harsh, while somehow it's funny because we'll give something like the Norse mythos a total pass. Nobody sits and goes, well,
Yeah.
Odin was cruel or whatever, so therefore I can't enjoy some of those, Nordic myths. And as I understand, it's just a story in some ways meant to be psychologically useful in helping people to make sense of and act in the world. Do you see the literal interpretation as being sort of a problem with religion and why people have difficulty with the Bible?
Well, I think I always kind of joke and say it's not totally a joke, but I always tell people like there is no literal interpretation, in the sense that the reason why these stories are being told is because they have meaning. It's like they were chosen out of an indefinite amount of things that happened or didn't happen or whatever, and they were chosen and put there because they have a specific meaning, a specific function, a specific piece of the puzzle in a bigger, let's say, full pattern of being. And so I think that's how you have to see it. I don't, I always tell people, like, I think a lot of things in the old, even in the Old Testament, I think a lot of the things happened, but I don't think they happened in the way that like I drank my coffee this morning. It's like there are different levels of how events can happen. And I think that especially as time goes by, the events get compressed into more and more compressed categories so that they can survive the centuries and the millennia. It's like if I told a story about, how I got in my, whatever year Buick and drank a cup of a cup of latte coffee, it's like that has a very, very short period of time for it to be an understandable story. But if I just say I got into a vehicle and drank my beverage, it's like that compresses the categories, and you can do that almost like on a cosmic scale. And so some images become typed, like the tree or the snake or the mountain or the like the rod, or like there's all these images that kind of compress a whole bunch of information into one single image. And so in that sense, it's like, I don't ask myself, like, I'm not even that bothered or like preoccupied with what happened, in what way did it happen. All I know is I have these stories, and these stories were handed to me by, thousands of years of people who took these stories as being the basis of their civilization. And so I take them that way, and I look at them that way, and then I say, I'm going to be generous to these stories, first of all. It's like, this is the legacy of my ancestors. I'm going to look at them with generosity first, and not with this kind of constant suspicion people have been doing. It's like, it's like there's this attitude of constant suspicion that everything that exists is there to trick you or to control you or to manipulate you. And it's like, man, my goodness, like, how do you live in that world? It's a really oppressive world. Maybe some of those are, but let's start by looking at them with a generous approach. And when you do that, like, the stories kind of open up in a way that you didn't expect, and you start to see patterns, and you realize that a lot of the stories, especially in the Old Testament, they're not there to a lot of them are not there to give you examples of how to act. They're there to show how the world works, like how the patterns of existence come together. And so there's no characters in the Bible that are just good, except maybe for Christ. Like, the all the characters in the Bible have a light and a dark side. It's like, like, if you think of any character, like Abraham definitely has a dark side. Like, he lied about his wife, and he does shady things. Like, everybody in the Bible has a dark side. So you have to just look at it and then try to take those characters and see how they relate to each other. And then slowly you just see, like, oh my goodness, this has more than what I was told. Like, if I look at it in terms of a story, it's way more powerful.
Why do you think it is that, in particular with Christianity, that it's been interpreted in a more literal fashion? I mean, I don't know if the people in Scandinavia really thought of, Thor and Odin as being people that somebody met, 10 generations ago and existed and had those kind of arguments, or if they really thought of it as more purely a mythological thing and were aware of that. Christianity seems to be much more, I can see how people would get it concerned and bogged down in whether or not these are literal
But
stories.
I think we have to be able to differentiate Christianity with the 19th century. It's like Christianity is 2,000 years. If you read the Church Fathers, if you read St. Gregory of Nyssa, who talks about the Old Testament stories, he talks about how they're a discussion about the soul and the struggle and the virtues of the soul and the struggles of the person against his passions, and so it's like he doesn't care whether they're happened or not. Like, he probably does think they happened, but that's not the focus of his interpretation. Like, the focus, why would you tell stories? Why would you care about these stories if all they were things that happened? Like, who cares about that? They're really something else. And so what happened in the West is that as the kind of the let's say the scientific mind grew after the Renaissance, with the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment, it's as if Christians felt the need to constantly defend it's like they got tricked into thinking that what their tradition was about and what the Bible was about, it was about the same thing that these scientists are talking about. And so they're trying to keep those two on the same par and trying to show, like crazy stuff. Like, in the 19th century, Christians were saying just insane things about like trying to interpret the Old Testament text and trying to historically, show that this person at that date and trying to date it precisely. And it's like, man, this is not helpful. It's not helpful for anybody.
Right.
And so when that broke finally, let's say in the 19th century, it was, and also the Enlightenment kind of was trying to break it. When it broke, it was like all of a sudden there was just this wave of derision towards religious stories and how silly and superstitious they are and how they're not scientifically accurate. And it's like they never were meant to be scientifically accurate. Right. And sadly, we have in North America, especially, we have this whole group of evangelicals that still think they still live in the 19th century and they still continue to like defend like tooth and nail their, like 6-day creation.
Right.
But it's like, dude, in the 2nd century, Origen was already telling you, it's like you can't have grass before the sun in terms of just mechanical reality. It's like, this is 2nd century stuff, people. It's like they already knew, like Origen was saying the same thing. It's like they knew that it was talking about reality in a different way, in a very powerful way. That story in Genesis, it's like, dude, the whole world is contained in that story. When I say the whole world, it's like the whole way in which we exist in reality is contained in that story. But it's definitely not a scientific description of how things happen.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a shame that people still, do pull those more literal interpretations or stick to that with their, all guns a-blazing with it. Because if you look, listening to somebody like Jordan sit down and discuss Genesis, I went, oh my God, like I had this ridiculous childish interpretation of this before, and I was attacking it on the basis of it being some, exact literal thing that needed to be broken down scientifically, which was silly because, again, I wouldn't do that if you told me the origin story out of Norse mythology or pretty much most other religions. I would never sit there and go, well, did that really occur? It's the usefulness of the story and the psychological level of it and the mythical manner is just goes so far well beyond that, and it's unfortunate that it's been kind of maligned or misinterpreted.
Well, one of the difficulties, and it's a real difficulty, is especially today because of how the people think today, is that there is in the Bible, especially in the Bible, there is a historical drive. That is, there is a sense into which the cosmic truth, let's say the transcendent truth, will manifest themselves in the world. That is, that it's not these opposed things, like that you have these stories that are patterns, let's say, that are kind of transcendent patterns, then you have reality and they're separate and they just kind of run their course. It's like, no, the biblical way of discussing the world is that the manifest world is a manifestation of those transcendent principles. And so if you look at the world, you will find the patterns manifesting themselves. And so some of the stories, that's what they're showing, but they're not doing it in a scientific way. Like I said, they're doing it by compressing these stories and sometimes describing things which are very difficult to describe in terms of a phenomenon, but using words that connect to higher meaning and doing it at the same time. So it's like, for example, for Christian, it is important that Christ, the historical figure of Christ, was a historical figure. But it doesn't mean that the stories that are told in the gospel are told in a kind of forensic, how someone would describe a crime scene to a policeman would describe a crime scene. Obviously not, because there are contradictions between the different gospels, and the people who put the gospels together knew there were contradictions, and they didn't resolve them. They just left them there. Right. There are things that, the same event, like things seem to happen differently. And it's like, because the point isn't to be accurate in describing an event, but to describe an event in a manner that shows how it connects to those higher principles. And to do that, you have to condense them, because that's what it means. Like, that's what it means for the higher principles to appear in the world, is that they bring things together. Like they clump phenomena into a narrative, like I told you. Like that's the idea of the logos. Like the logos takes all this indefinite field of phenomena. Like you look around the world, you look around you, there's a million things that you could look at. Like there's an indefinite amount of them. But your experience tells you that's a tree. It's not a million leaves and 100,000 branches. It's a tree. It's one thing. But it's not obvious that it is one thing. There's something in our consciousness which pulls it together, and that's the same process which pulls these stories together in the Bible. I like that. Sorry if I'm sounding a little bit like a preacher now.
No. This is good. It's exactly what I was hoping, stuff that you would get into. I knew you'd have good answers. Here's a question that I actually wanted to ask Jordan, but I didn't get a chance to. Are there things that the Christian faith, let's say, offers that you don't see in other religions or philosophy? In other words, why not be a Taoist or a Buddhist, which seem to cover much of the same ground without being maybe quite so vulnerable to misinterpretations, or they don't have a lot of those stories that people would object to, some of those more dark or grim things. Yeah.
Well, the thing there's a few things that Christianity I'm not an expert on other religions. I know more than, let's say, just the person on the street, but I'm definitely not an expert. And one of the things that Christianity tries to express is the problem of multiplicity, right? The problem of manifestation, okay? And so how can there be multiplicity and unity at the same time? So how can you have, it's also even the whole idea of how can you have suffering, and how can you unite the notion of suffering with this kind of infinite unity, let's say. And it's like, that's what Christianity is trying to kind of reconcile all those things together. So the idea of the crucified Christ, that's what it's about. It's about, this idea of God uniting with man and then uniting with death. And then the whole thing stretches out, and the whole range of experience becomes connected, and you can find the divine in the whole thing, And it's like, so the idea is not to deny suffering, but to, in the most crazy contradictory way, to kind of see that as you descend into suffering, that the transcendent is still there. It's like, that's what Christianity is about, and how that connects you to the highest thing. I think that's one thing. But I think that in terms of just reality, like real, it's like we're not atomized individuals. Like we don't exist separate from the people that gave birth to us and gave life to us and gave, so we are a chain. We are a chain in a history. We are a chain in a series of events, and those series of events brought the West to join with this like Semitic world and fuse a way of being and a way of thinking, which then expanded, and basically civilized Europe. It's like people always think, it's like the Vikings, especially there's a lot of these neo-pagans around, like talking about Thor. It's like, the Vikings, all they were doing were like raping and pillaging and cutting people's heads off before they became Christians. It's like then when they became Christians, then they were the Normans. Then they were the kings of Sicily and the kings of England. And it was like then they kicked ass like seriously, because they had that basis, they had that structure to kind of channel their Nordic whatever energy into, and also because then their Nordic kind of warrior like character could be put in service of the weak, at least ideally, because a Viking with his axe doesn't care about anybody. He just cares about getting the gold and the honor and the women, right? Whereas the knight, obviously in practice, it doesn't always happen that way, but at least the ideal of the knight is to fight for the weakest person, to fight for your lady, to fight for the orphan. It's like, that's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. And so we should really freaking dread like the return of the North, man, because you know what that looks like? That looks like 1930s Germany. That's what it looks like. The return of that pagan thing, man. It's gonna like there's some of that in the air, and it's like you need to realize what that is. It means chopping heads off. That's what it means.
That's interesting. Oh man, I may have to rethink my holiday celebrations. But I started playing around with celebrating Yule just because I was like, oh, it's a lot like Christmas. It's got the basic things going on there without the necessarily the religious connotation, modern religious connotation. So but that's interesting. Now I'm gonna be thinking about that a lot.
But the other thing about the paganism, and you really have to think this through, is the one of the problem with the neo-pagans right now is that they're just basically making it up as they go along.
No, that's true.
Right,
we don't really
know. They don't have that handed down tradition. Like they're not a link. They're basically necromancers. Like they've dug a body out of the ground, and now they're trying to like magically bring it back to life. It's like, dude, that body is dead. It's been integrated into the wider Christian civilization. And so there's a lot of the Nordic stories that are like and even the Nordic stories we know today, they were written by a Christian. Like the Northmen didn't write down their stories, like, and so even the ones that we have are already joined with like the Christian tradition. So there's room, and that's what the knight. That's I keep telling people. It's like there were no knights until the Northmen converted. Like the idea of the knight is the joining of like Rome joined with let's say a Semitic world and created a certain way of being, like a Christian empire, let's say. That the ideal of that is like Byzantium, let's say. But then that world joined with the northern people and created like the holy warrior, because it wasn't there before. And this whole idea of the knight is really the joining of the northern way of seeing the world with the southern. And that's why like even in Byzantium, the army of the emperor, the guard of the emperor were the Varangians. So the Varangians were all these Norwegian types, like Danish types, who came to Russia and became the elite of Russia. And when they converted to Christianity, it's like then they became the real army of the Byzantine emperor. And it was like it's like you have to be able to see, and then we're the legacy of that. And so to go back and to say Thor, it's like, why do you say Thor? Like, why don't you say St. George? Everything you want in Thor is in St. George, and you don't have to dig up a dead body to get St. George. Like there's still churches named after him in your town, probably.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, because I think a lot of people see those parts of the Bible that they don't like, and they go, I can't buy into the rest of this because of X, Y, Z, and it gets tricky. I know, like in I don't know how familiar you are with the Dune novels by Frank Herbert, but I
read a few, but it was a long time ago, so I'm not super.
So in that, and maybe you can tell me what you think of if this would be possible or wise. In the Dune universe, they have an ecumenical council set up, and they take basically all of the I don't know what they define as the best parts, but they take the best parts sort of all religions and turn them into the Orange Catholic Bible as this one unifying sort of thing. Do you think it would ever be useful to try and do something like that with religion, just to, appeal to more people and unify? Or do you think that these things are part of a bigger pattern, and if you pull them out of there and say, well, we don't like when Moses told them to go kill all those people in that town or something, that's not good, we got to pull that out? Do you think that would start to unravel the entire thing?
I think it would start to unravel, and I think that it's really important to keep those dark stories in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to keep those dark stories, because God, first of all, God is not your it's not your sugar daddy. Like, God is the absolute, manifestation, the absolute infinite, the absolute non-dual infinite that and sometimes that non-dual absolute infinite appears as a raging fire. It's like, I don't know why people are bothered by that. It's like people read the Bhagavad Gita and they're like, oh, this is amazing. But then the idea that God would appear as this raging like fire, like, it totally bothers them. It's like, dude, are you like, how can you get those two things to coincide, man? It's like, but then that's not all God is. God is everything and nothing and above all categories. And so you need to keep the darker stories in the Bible, because they act as this balance also to think that you've got it all figured out. And that's one of the like, I'm going to get into trouble by talking about this, but one of the problems with, in my opinion, with Islam has been that they try to eliminate all the weird stories in the Bible. Like in the Quran, they say that they rectify the Bible. And so all the weird stories, like the stories about incest and like all the kind of stuff that you're like, oh my goodness, this is really dark, they just took it out because they want things to fit in a nice box. Whereas when you read the Bible, it's so complex, and you're like, how the hell is this possible? Like, how is this possible that this is happening? And you kind of do it, approach it with a kind of generosity. And then sometimes it just hits you, like it just smacks you. And you're like, oh my goodness, this is what this is talking about. And it's not telling me to do this. No, it's trying to show this huge pattern. And part of the pattern is the things that don't make sense. Some part of the pattern is the fringe and the margin. And I talk about this a lot for people who want to that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about this now. Like, a lot of the talks that I give are about this idea of things that don't fit, the idea of the margin, the idea of the periphery, because it seems like that's at the same time, that's what we're dealing with in our society today. But it's like we're dealing with it and we don't know how to deal with it at the same time. And so to kind of talk about these issues of things that are weird and don't fit, like, I think that's helpful today.
I think so too. Yeah, it's interesting how, like, I wouldn't expect to watch. I mean, there's some movies that I get great meaning from, and that are just wonderful, and whether it's Star Trek, Star Wars, whatever, things like that I've derived a lot of value from, but I never expect them to be 100% puppies and kittens and all that. But somehow with religion, and I don't know if that's because everybody keeps trying to argue that it's just this big thing of peace, and then someone goes, well, yeah, but this part isn't peaceful. But I don't know why we do that with, in particular, like you said, with the Bible versus, someone could go read the Bhagavad Gita and be like, oh, sure, yeah, no problem. They don't have any objections to massive holy wars or anything like that. So it's an interesting double standard, I suppose.
But we're in like, it's weird, like we're in a self-destructive mode, like our whole society is in this self-destructive mode. And when you're and it's really at the end, like the end of a civilization, you see that all over the place. Like, it's like, when the Vikings, when the Germanic people came down to like start chopping heads in the Roman Empire, the young people were dressing like Vikings. Like they were the elites were complaining that the young people were dressing like the Northmen out of this kind of rebellious spirit, And so it's like this. We are at this point where we hate our culture, we hate our heritage, and we're just trying to like evacuate it as much as possible. And then people, they like, it's like you get these people who like hate Christianity, hate organized religion, and then they're like, oh, but I'm really into tantric, Buddhism. It's like,
right.
what the hell, man? It's like,
Yeah.
are you serious? Like, have you read any of that stuff? Like, I don't even want to criticize Tantric Buddhism, but it's like, if you've actually paid attention to what this stuff is saying, it's like, I don't know why you're bothered with like these stories in the Old Testament that are strange, or that are violent, or that are kind of, or that represent the infinite as like this kind of raging thing. It's like, I don't know what to tell you, man.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think if we had better people out there explaining these things, more Petersons, it would definitely help, because that's what it took for me to kind of start coming around. I'm kind of embarrassed at how simplistic my view was before, and how much I attacked these things that had great value and really hold up our system in a lot of ways. And certainly there are problems, but we don't want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were. And it's it's a real issue these days, for sure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of parts in the Bible that people would raise objection to, again, on this line of being nonsensical or superstitious. For example, recently I was talking to my wife about how I've started to better understand the value in these stories, but I still couldn't figure out things like how anybody would justify not mixing wool with linen. That just seems so crazy. And then I saw your video where you addressed exactly that and on the purity laws. So that was really helpful. Can you explain some of that for the audience, like some of these purity laws and how those make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah, well, the idea is that you have to, first of all, when you interpret symbolism in the Bible, you really have to, even the laws in the Bible, you have to interpret them phenomenologically, okay? So phenomenologically means how you experience the world, like how you kind of engage with the world. So the way we engage with the world is that we have categories of beings, right? We have trees, we have categories of actual literal objects. And then we have categories that are like, mine and yours and inside and outside, right? And you need to keep those categories separate. You need to make sure that, let's say, the difference between mine and yours is clearly demarked. Because if it's not clear, then we're going to fight over it, right? And you need to be able to know like what the clear demarcation, let's say, of inside and outside. If you don't have that clear, then you have the problem. Let's say right now, like you have this problem in the U.S. with millions of illegal immigrants, right? And so some people are saying, let's all let them in. Some people are saying, let's all throw them out. And it's like the problem is the fact that you have so much that isn't clearly either inside or outside. That's the problem, right? And so you need to have clear demarcations. But at the same time, you also need to leave some buffer for the in-between, right? But the buffer for the in-between is like the margin. So the purity laws, especially the mixing linen and wool, they have to do with that. So the laws, they're set up in a pattern. There's one that says you will not mix two kinds of seeds in your field. And the second one says you will not mix linen and wool in your clothing. I forgot one in the middle. Sorry. You won't. Yeah. Then it said you won't yoke an ox and an ass together to plow your field. And then the last law talks about keeping a fringe on your vestment that is intertwined cords. So you think like that doesn't make any sense at all. Like it's just absolute absurd, just like arbitrary things, okay? But if you look at it, it actually follows the order of the creation story in Genesis. And so the first two, which is not mixing two kinds of seeds together, that's the creation of plants. You get that at the beginning of Genesis. Then not putting the ox and the ass together, that's the creation of animals. And then after that, you're not supposed to mix wool and linen in your clothing. That's man, okay? And then the last one, which is the fringe, that has to do with the Sabbath, the idea of leaving a part of the world that you don't work, that is left unworked. And so that idea of Sabbath is there in time. You have the Sabbath, you have the Jubilee. There's a lot of these cycles we have it in our week, like we have days off, right? The idea that at the end of a cycle, you need to leave a holiday, or you need to leave something, a carnival or some festival that will be a kind of a transition time between the beginning, the end of a cycle and the beginning of another. And in space, it's the same. So you leave a buffer around you. So this idea that you have to leave a fringe on your vestment has to do with leaving that buffer around you. So the basic idea is that it's not just a bunch of stuff you're supposed to do. It's a kind of like telling your kid to make their bed or to wash their hands. It's like you're giving people a way of being that will then have repercussions in their way of seeing the world. So if you tell people don't mix seeds, don't mix, different types of cloth, it's like they realize that, no, you need to keep things separate and you need to not mix them, because if you mix them too much, then you get confusion and the world starts to fall apart. And so that's based, I don't know if that's clear enough. It's hard to explain fast. But if people want to hear more about it, they can watch the video where I explain it more fully.
That video is good. Yeah, and I like the whole concept too of the sort of separateness but together kind of thing that you
yeah. And in Christianity, then there's really that idea of like, for example, in the Old Testament, there's a law that says you shouldn't mix wool and linen together. And in Christianity, there's a tradition that in a cloth that's used, let's say, during the liturgy to cover the body and blood of Christ, it's made specifically out of wool and linen. So it's to show that, yes, you do need to keep these separate, but let's say in Christ, in the transcendent, in the absolute, those things aren't separate. Like, they do come together, and there are ways to bring them together. And so it's almost like a sexual union too. Like, you need to make sure that you keep man and woman separate, but then you also need them to join together while remaining separate, let's say, and then that's what produces life. And so there's all that. It's like a cosmic. It's really a cosmic structure, let's say.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. What about? I'm going to hit you on this one then. What about the not eating pork and shellfish? How does that one work?
That's a bit more complicated, but there are reasons why you shouldn't, like the laws in the Old Testament of which animals you're not supposed to eat. I'll just use the pork example. Sure. That'll, because explaining each one will be difficult. This I get from my brother a lot. My brother Matthew, he's writing a book right now, and he's really kind of been able to understand this quite a bit. So the idea is that it's not that you're not allowed to eat pork, right? That's not the rule. The rule is that what you're supposed to eat has to have split hooves, okay? And it has to ruminate its food, okay? Okay. That's the rule, okay? So pork is just one example of that, right? Because a pig has split hooves, but it doesn't ruminate, so you can't eat pig. Thing like that is just arbitrary. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so why is it that you have to eat those animals? Well, it has to do with what I said. The split hooves represent the separation. So you need two clearly separate, a hoof that is clearly separate, so that the concept stands in clear categories. And then the idea of ruminating, I mean, it has to do with this idea of not, let's say, of taking, how can I say this? Of integrating reality properly. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea of integrating reality properly and having a clear separation. And so there's both this idea of separation, but also of properly integrating. So let's say a pig and a dog, good example, like they'll defecate and then they'll go back and eat their feces. Okay. So that's an example of an improper integration of reality, where you don't integrate reality properly, and then you go back to it, and then you soil yourself with what you cast aside. Okay, so it's really like a cosmic image. I don't know if people are going to get what I'm saying, because this gets very kind of esoteric. But there's definitely a let's say an ontological reason, a reason that's related on how we live in the world, why we don't do that. But Christians, they do eat pork. Like, yeah,
I feel like maybe that's one of those ones where people thought, this might not be the most pragmatic or useful, literal rule to move along with.
Well, no, because in Christianity there really is this idea that, let's say, you have pure and impure, right? And so you can't eat the impure meats, you can eat the pure meats. In Christianity, there's this idea that what was impure can be transformed, like can be made pure, okay? And so that's why the fact that we eat pork, it actually comes from a vision of St. Peter. St. Peter, in a vision, saw this cloth, this four-cornered cloth that opened up, and then on the cloth, he had all these kinds of meats, and then God told Peter, eat. And he said, no, I can't, because there's impure meat in this thing. And God said, no, eat also the impure meat. And he saw it, meaning that Christianity was going to be this universal thing, which was going to kind of expand out of Judaism and kind of move out into the world and start to include all these impure things, but transform them. And so it has to do with this idea of the Nordic thing that we talked about. Christianity always like comes to a culture and then takes the best of that culture and integrates it. It's like the stories of that's why it's the Christians that write the let's say the northern myths, and they preserve the festivals, but they'll clean them up, like maybe there won't be orgies at the festival anymore.
Yeah.
Like we'll still celebrate on that day, we'll still have a celebration, but maybe we won't, sacrifice a child, maybe. It's like whatever, like the kind of crazy, kind of orgiastic or kind of part of the culture they're coming into, they'll integrate it, but then they'll kind of smooth it out, let's say.
Yeah.
So that's part of why Christians eat pork.
Okay. That makes some sense. And I imagine that one's in the New Testament specifically, that story. Okay. And that explains why the Jews, the Orthodox still don't. Okay. That's good, actually. That one really, I had no idea about the answer to that one. So
there is even in Judaism, they have this idea, like the more kind of profound Jews, they have this idea, they call it the kosher pig. They have this idea that, let's say, at some point, the pig will return, will come back, let's say, and become kosher. And so even within Jewish tradition, there's this idea that at some point Judaism will have to join itself with the outer world. Like it's going to happen. It's just a question of when. And they tend to think of it as the kind of in the messianic age or whatever, like this idea of an unknown future. Like the duality will be transcended. Like the duality of pure be transcended.
Interesting. Okay. I like that. No, that's very interesting. And I like the observation of that, Christianity, or at least the take that when Christianity, that they really kind of integrated these things and, pulled the Bruce Lee and said, let's take the useful parts and get rid of the rest, as opposed to sort of the more self-destructive image that I had growing up of, these poor pagans got, slammed down by this evil, church that came in and took over and renamed their holidays and stole it for their, appropriated it or whatever it were. It's nice to hear a better perspective on that might be a little more useful and productive.
Yeah, but it's not like there wasn't some of that happening. Obviously, I mean, when two civilizations kind of come together, some of that happens. But if you look at, like, a lot of people talk about, let's say, like the Celtic world. If you look at the Celtic world, like the Celtic world had been decimated before Christians ever arrived. The Druids were almost completely, eliminated by Julius Caesar because they were his political opposition. And so it seems like that's why one of the reasons why the Celts actually converted to Christianity so early is because Christianity actually filled this kind of hole that had been dug into their culture. And they were Christians like before the like Nordic, the Germanic part of England was Christian. Like Ireland was all the way out there and kind of preserving Christianity, and in between they had these barbarians, and they were struggling even to communicate with other Christians because they were so isolated. And it was like, so there wasn't like this church, especially then, like there wasn't this church that was pounding, like they were out there on their own doing their thing, creating these amazing works of art in the Book of Kells and these just astounding works of art.
Yeah, I think you definitely touched on a key point too, being holes in culture. I think that's a lot of what we're struggling with now, is that by rejecting Christianity and even just Western values in general, we've created this sort of hole in the culture, and the problem that I never noticed before is what does that hole get filled in with, and people tend to not choose wisely, on the fly. So it's, I can definitely see the problem with that, or, how Jordan talks about Nietzsche's, view of when, God is dead, but then, all the problems that come in once you've destroyed that, assuming that you can't just be the Uberman suddenly.
I don't know a lot of Ubermen. I don't know. I haven't met that many.
Well, it does seem to be. I realize that whole concept of like, you can't necessarily. Sometimes you can't make yourself, understand all these things. I mean, I can hardly get myself out of bed some days to do work, so I figure, maybe I'm not always my best own master of all these things, and I might need something greater to help me integrate and understand and be as functional and useful and I don't know, doing as much good in the world as I possibly can. So although I'm still drawing probably just as much on mythology from many stories as I am maybe from religion at this point, but all useful stuff that we can't dismiss so easily, I think. And so now I have a somewhat more selfish question for you. You have said, I think you said something to the effect of Saint Christopher should be the patron saint of our times, and he's my namesake. So, and I used to always object to it. I hated having a Christian name in some ways, but now I've been so curious about it lately. And why is Saint Christopher so relevant or meaningful these days?
Well, Saint Christopher is a monster. Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. I'm used to being a monster of sorts for a lot of people. So
the tradition of Saint Christopher is that he's one of two things, depending on which tradition. Mm-hmm. He's either a giant, okay, 12 feet tall, like, or he's a dog-headed man, and so. Those are the two traditions about Saint Christopher. But the biggest idea is that he's like this monster from the edge of the world. Like he's this kind of out of control beast, that can't control, that is just kind of pure strength and so Saint Christopher, I'll tell you that like the basic story of the one that's most known. So Saint Christopher, he's a Canaanite, like in the story. So he's a descendant of these giants. The Canaanites are like the descendant of these giants from the Noah's Ark, like this really mythological time. Okay. And so he decides, he's this really fierce warrior, and he decides he wants to serve the strongest man, like the most powerful man in the world. Mm-hmm. And so he goes out into the world and he finds the most powerful king, and he becomes a servant of this king. And then, as he's the servant of this king, he realizes that the king is afraid of the devil, and so Saint Christopher asks the king, like, who's this devil? And the king doesn't want to tell him, but Saint Christopher says, unless you tell me who the devil is, I'm not going to serve you anymore. So the king feels like he's obligated. He tells him who the devil is, and based on that, Saint Christopher leaves and then goes to find the devil. Then he finds the devil, and he becomes a servant of the devil. And at some point he sees that the devil is like afraid of the cross, and so he's like, what is this cross? Like, what is this talk? What is this about? So he asks the devil, like, what is this? Who is this? What is this cross? What is it about? The devil doesn't want to tell him, right? Mm-hmm. And so he tells the devil, unless you tell me like what this cross is and who this person is, what is this about? Like, I'm going to leave you. And so the devil tells him he says that, well, it's Christ. And so now St. Christopher leaves the devil and goes to follow Christ, but he doesn't know what that means. So he like goes out and he's looking for Christ, and he finds this monk, and the monk he says, like, I'm looking for Christ. And the monk says, okay, well, I'll tell you what you need to do. So he says, you have to pray, like you have to pray. And so Christopher's like, no, I can't pray. Like, forget that. And so the monk says, well, okay, well, maybe you can fast, like you can fast, and that'll help. And then St. Christopher's like, sorry, I'm not fasting. It's not going to happen. So the monk says, okay, so how about this? You could stand on the side of the river, and then you can help people to cross over, okay? Mm-hmm. So you really have to see this image, like, because you have to see this image of this monster that stands on the edge of the world. You know that image. Everybody knows that image. Okay? Yeah. So it's Atlas. It's it's the Leviathan. It's like this monster that it's the Cerberus who guards the edge between the earthly realm and the Hades. It's the dog of hell, right? So here's Saint Christopher, this dog-headed man, this giant, this dog of hell, who stands on the edge of the world, and he helps people to cross over, to cross between the two sides. Mm-hmm. And so then this little child comes up to him and asks St. Christopher to cross him over. So St. Christopher puts him up on his shoulders, and he starts to cross in the water. And as he's crossing, he starts sinking in the water, and he gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And by the time he's in the middle of the river, he feels like the whole world is on his shoulders, and he can't hold it anymore. So finally, with all his strength, he kind of goes down into the water and comes back up, and he's holding this child so the child won't go under. And he crosses over, and he brings the child to the other side. Then he asks the child, he says, why are you so heavy? Like, why were you so heavy? Why couldn't I cross you over? And the child answers, because I'm carrying the sins of the world. And so the idea is that he took Christ and he crossed him over. And so the idea of St. Christopher is that as we stand at the end of the world, like as we stand in this world of chaos and of division and of fragmentation and of monsters, like, because that's our world, like that's the world we live in, like we're surrounded by monsters. Our popular culture is just filled to the brim with monsters, and that's not arbitrary. That's a sign of our general state as a culture. The idea is to look out for that possibility to take the logos, to take the spirit, to take the highest possible thing and bring it with us and make it cross over that river so that it bring it into the next world, or bring it into the next world in the sense of, a new beginning, let's say. Say it that way. To be able to use the monster and to use this this state as an ark, as a vehicle to bring life to a new beginning. So that's why I think St. Christopher is the patron saint of our age, because I don't see who else could be.
I like that. That's I'm gonna have to look into that. I only knew the basic myth of, oh yeah, he carried the baby Jesus across, something, but that was it. I had no idea about any of the rest of that. So
well, I gave a talk. It's on my YouTube channel. It's called Pentecost for the Zombie Apocalypse.
I haven't watched that one yet, but I saw it.
You should check that out. I talk about that.
Okay.
I talk about St. Christopher a lot, and I show images of him as a dog-headed man, and I talk about monsters. It's all about monsters, basically. So I'm
also going to now Photoshop my dog's head onto my body later on. I gotta do that. But that's great. I can't wait to check that out. So let's see. We're so short. We're kind of almost out of time here. But I wanted to ask you. Let's see. One kind of bigger question in some way. How can symbolism make the world, or interpretation, whatever, symbolic study, make the world a more magical place? You've mentioned something to that effect before.
Well, I think that the thing about sorry.
It's okay.
So
I had one go off too. Okay.
So the thing about reality, I talked a little bit about how reality works. The way we encounter reality is that our consciousness groups things together into patterns, right? Okay, that's just how it works. Like we engage the world in narrative and in pattern, and so once you become aware of that, okay, once you start to see it, and when you start to be aware of the basic patterns that are in stories, what happens is that they actually start to manifest themselves in your life. And you actually start to live in a world that's patterned. And then it becomes really freaky. Like weird things start to happen. People are used to the word synchronicity, let's say.
Yes.
And you'll see those things start to kind of fit together, and your life starts to take on that's what I mean by a kind of a magical thing, because all of a sudden all these events start to coalesce around you. It's like you're not even doing anything, and then you it's weird. Like it gets really weird. Like sometimes you'll say you're thinking about something or you're reading about something, and then you get up, you go to the store, and then all of a sudden there's this glaring sign that it's like exactly what you were reading in the book, and like the world just starts to fit in these strange patterns. Like I can't really. It's hard to describe to people because people will think like it's just your imagination. But it's real. Like it's actually real. Like I'll give you an example that happened to me just the other day, which is very strange. So I made this icon of Jonah, right? And so I made this big icon of Jonah coming out of the whale, and I put it up on Twitter. And I was like, I finished the icon. When I finish an icon, I always put it up on social media. And then it's just the next morning that I found out that I'd put it up on the feast day of Jonah. It's like, I mean, it's a really little thing, but then when your whole life starts to be full of those, like it just happens all the time. It's like, wow. You don't even have to tell people, like I'm telling you because you're asking me, but you just kind of have to, you go through, and it's like, it's this joyful kind of, it gives you this confidence in life and this confidence in the fact that you're moving in a direction. I mean, it's not just about studying symbolism. It has more to do with living forthrightly and living kind of like Jordan Peterson talks about, this idea of living in truth, and I would add living in prayer and living, and kind of living a deliberate life instead of just being kind of floating in the ocean and just letting yourself, go back and forth between your different desires, let's say. Right. And so it really, it's pretty amazing. Like when I started studying St. Christopher, I got really intensely into it, and I actually wrote I wrote all this stuff about him. I wrote like a screenplay on his life, and I did all of this stuff. And as it was happening, it was absolutely crazy. Like, I can't believe I'm telling you this, but let's say because there's a symbolism. Do you know what a sundog is?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so a sundog is when 3 suns appear in the sky. Have you ever seen that?
Okay, I have not seen that, but I.
All right, okay. So the symbolism of the sundog in, like, let's say, Native American traditions has to do with everything St. Christopher is related to. Has to do with, like, the idea of the end of the world, this idea of the edge of the world and everything. And so I was doing research again. I read about these sundogs and about St. Christopher. It's like while I was doing this, in like 1 year, I must have seen like 15 sundogs. Like I just saw them all the time. It was almost like every week I would look up in the sky and there was 3 suns up in the sky. And it's like, I don't know if it's a rare phenomena, but for some reason I was seeing them all the time. Like it has to do with a rainbow around the sun, but in a certain way that it's placed. It's like when the sun is at a certain height, it appears as like three bright spots in the sky. And it was like, I just kept seeing them like all the time. So it was like, that's really crazy.
It is interesting how when you're like, I don't know, somehow when you're in what people would call a Zen state or just in this mode of being where, I don't know, you're aiming higher, your direction is in a certain orchestrated manner that you do start noticing those things a lot more. You can anyway, and it can make the world much more interesting and magical, or whatever you want to call it. I certainly used to call it synchronicity myself, and I noticed it a lot, especially after taking psychedelics. It came out to me a lot, but and now it's more when I'm in tune and doing things. Yeah, in a certain manner, I can be, I don't know, I start seeing those things more. It's really interesting, and I could sit down and scientifically break it down into some sort of coincidence type thing, maybe, but certainly doesn't make it more useful or fun to think about.
Right. So here's a way to blow your mind, is that when you're in tune with things completely, it's like you're in the pattern, right? You're participating in the pattern, and in a way, it's like the causality becomes muddled between what you're causing, how you're being caused. It's like it's not muddled in the sense that it becomes unified in your experience. Those things become one. And so if you take that a lot further, because here we are, these little losers, like we're not great spiritual masters. But if you take that times 1,000, times 100, like what that could mean and what a miracle could mean, if you just meditate on that just a little bit, you'd be surprised like how that could really come together in something which is beyond what my little sundog visions are,
Sure. I wonder, somehow it seems like it might be somewhat related to the, Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss and the universe will open doors where there were only walls. And I wonder if sometimes maybe even through your work, through the iconography, that it, when people contemplate it and you think it opens up a perceptual door for them or somewhere, having to do with that.
On my good days, I hope that's what it's doing.
Well, I hope you have a lot of good days.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, part of why I'm making these icons is because is a way to integrate my life, to integrate my art and, and then my writings and my faith and my family life, because I'm at home and we homeschool. And so it's like we have this kind of really kind of buoyant, energetic family life. And so all of that, it's a way to kind of bring all of this together into a cohesive whole. And I definitely wouldn't trade it for anything right now.
It's great. I love it. I may contact you separately as a parent to ask you about all the homeschooling stuff one of these days. Actually, mine just got home from her preschool, aka glorified daycare. You can come say hi, sweetie. Anyhow, so I'll wrap it up because we're running out of time here. But is there anything else that I missed that you want to talk about? Projects coming up, going on, things that people you want to let people know about?
Well, I don't know when you're going to put this up, but I'm going to be on the West Coast at the end of the month. I'm going to be in Seattle with Jordan Peterson on the weekend of October, was it 25th, 26th, 27th? I'm not sure. Around there.
I think so. I think 27th.
So we've got a conference with Jordan Peterson there, and then we're going to be in Vancouver on November 4th at let's see. I want to meet your. I can meet you.
Say hi, Kira. There's
Hello.
Kira.
Hi.
That's Jonathan, Kira.
Hi.
Okay, we're wrapping up a podcast. You just be quiet and we'll talk. Yeah, we'll be up there
I'll be in
for that.
Vancouver on November 3rd and 4th with Jordan again. So if people on the West Coast want to check that out, that'd be wonderful. And if not, then check out my YouTube channel. I'm trying to put up stuff, at least once every 2 weeks, maybe once a week, depending on how much energy and time I've got. But I'm having a lot of fun with it.
That's great. I'm enjoying the videos. It's been good stuff. So glad you're out there, and it's been a great conversation. There's so much more I would love to get into, little nuances and pieces that I want to discuss, but as you can tell, because we ran over time. So anyway, maybe another time we'll get into more.
All right, and I wish you all the best on your journey and your path. It's kind of opening up in front of you, and stay in touch. Tell me where it leads you.
I will, absolutely.
All right.
Thanks for being on, Jonathan.
Alright, so that was our talk with Jonathan Pageau. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. I plan to have him back on. I might even try and do a little in-between episode and do some follow-up questions that I was hoping to get into with him that we didn't get to. I enjoyed our conversation so much that it ran long, and I still didn't get to discuss everything with him. So anyhow, again, yes, hope you enjoyed the show. You can find out more information about the show at dspodcast.com. If you want to help support us, you can check out the Datsusara Gear website, which is at DSGEAR.com. That is my company where we offer all sorts of primarily hemp-based gear, apparel, duffel bags, backpacks, towels, hoodies, all kinds of stuff primarily made with hemp. All that being naturally antimicrobial, breathable, strong, sustainable, all that good stuff for those interested. And to find out more about me personally, the best place to look is probably my Twitter feed, which is at DatsuChris, DATSUCHRIS, or track me down on various social media outlets. And that's about it. All right, thanks for joining the conversation. Be seeing you.
Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way.